Patrice held the bag out the way you hand something to a stranger, arm extended, eyes steady, no hesitation in her face at all. It was a black trash bag, the kind you use for garbage. I looked at it. Then I looked at her. Then I looked past her into the hallway of the house I had lived in for 31 years, where my son was standing with his phone in his hand, not looking at me, telling someone on the other end that the preliminary property valuation for probate review could move forward now. I took the bag. I want you to understand something about that moment. I did not take it because I was defeated. I took it because I have never in 68 years given anyone the satisfaction of watching me come apart in their doorway. Whatever was about to happen to me, it was not going to happen in front of Patrice. My name is Elaine Voss. 4 days ago, I buried my husband of 40 years. This morning, my son and his wife put my belongings in a trash bag and told me the house was being assessed pending estate review. I walked to my car. James did not follow me out. Patrice stood in the doorway until she heard my car door close. I felt her watching, the way you feel a temperature change. And then I heard the front door shut behind her. I sat in that car, and I did not move. If you are watching this, I want to know where you are right now. Drop it in the comments. Because what I am about to tell you, I need witnesses for. 4 weeks before he died, Walter sat at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning, moving slower than usual. I noticed it. I set it aside the way you set things aside when you are not ready to know what they mean. He placed an envelope next to my coffee cup. I thought it was a card. We had done that across 40 years. Small notes, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet language of two people who had chosen each other long enough that the choosing had become its own kind of fluency. It was not just a card. Inside was a key. Plain ring, no label, and a note card in Walter's handwriting, the careful, deliberate print he used when he wanted to be sure he was understood. Your real gift. The address is on the back. Don't tell James about it. I love you more than I ever knew how to say. I laughed. I asked him what he was hiding. He smiled. That particular smile, the one that meant he had already thought further ahead than I had. And he said I would understand when I saw it. 4 days later, he was gone. I sat at that kitchen table for 3 days after the funeral, surrounded by casserole dishes and condolence cards. And I forgot about the key entirely. Grief does that. It narrows everything down to the immediate, the next hour, the next breath, the next person who needs you to hold yourself together so they can fall apart. 2 days after the funeral, I called an attorney. I told her James was already talking about valuations, transfers, and estate authority in ways that did not feel normal to me. She told me I needed to see the will before there was anything formal to challenge, and that no legitimate transfer of the house would happen overnight, no matter how urgently anyone behaved. James had not shown me the will. I had been waiting. Sitting in that car with a trash bag in my back seat and my husband 4 days in the ground, I reached into my purse for my phone. And my fingers found something else first. The key. Still on its plain ring. Still carrying the weight of a man who told me not to tell James. I held it in my palm for a long moment. Then I reached back into the bag and found the card. Walter's handwriting. I turned it over. I read the address on the back for the first time. The house knew before I did. That is the only way I can explain it. The morning after Walter died, I came downstairs and the kitchen felt wrong in a way I could not name. Not empty, not quiet, just fundamentally reorganized by something I could not see. 40 years of a man's presence leaves a shape in a house. When that shape disappears, the walls remember it even when you are too broken to. I moved through those 4 days, the way you move through deep water. Everything took longer than it should have. Sound arrived slightly delayed. I would start a sentence and forget what I meant by it before I reached the end. James was not moving through water. I understand that now. At the time, I read his behavior as grief expressing itself practically. The way some people cry and other people organize. By the second day, he was making calls in the back bedroom with the door pulled halfway closed. I heard his voice, but not his words. I told myself he was handling arrangements. He was handling something. Arrangements was not the word for it. He asked me twice that week where Walter kept the business files. He asked it gently, the way you ask a grieving woman something you have framed as helpful. The second time he asked, he mentioned needing records ready before the estate attorneys and accountants began requesting preliminary documentation for probate review. I told him I wasn't sure. He nodded and said not to worry about it. I did not worry about it. That was the problem. Patrice was attentive in those 4 days in a way I had always wanted her to be and had mostly given up expecting. She handled the food. She managed the calls. She sat with me in the evenings and asked what I needed and brought me things before I finished answering. At the time, I received it as kindness. What it was management. Keep a lane looking left while James worked on the right. I do not know if Patrice understood the full shape of what they were doing. I know she was not doing it by accident. But once, only once, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and found her standing at the counter with both hands pressed flat against it. Eyes closed hard, like someone holding herself together privately before anyone else came back into the room. The expression disappeared so quickly, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. By the time she turned toward me, she was composed again, already asking whether I had eaten. The funeral was a Wednesday. Birmingham turned out the way Birmingham turns out for a man like Walter. People from the church, from the business community, from 40 years of accumulated presence in this city. The eulogies were true. That much I can say without complication. Walter Voss was genuinely loved by people who had no reason to perform it. James delivered remarks that made 3 people in the front row weep. He was composed and specific. And I watched him from my seat and thought, I am looking at my son, and I am proud of him, and I do not know why something underneath that pride feels like a warning. I know why now. There was a woman at the reception I recognized from Walter's company events, Claudette Sims. She had retired some years back, but she and Walter had remained friendly in the quiet way of people who respected each other enough not to need regular contact. She came to the reception, spoke to a small group near the window, and then crossed the room to James. Their conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. I could not hear it. What I remember is Claudette's expression. Not grief, exactly. Not the soft, blurred look of someone paying respects. Something more settled than that. More deliberate. James stopped speaking halfway through whatever sentence he had been saying. That landed somewhere in me even then, though I did not understand why. She left shortly after. A week later, I found a voicemail I had missed, left the day after the funeral from a number I did not recognize. The day after the funeral, I was not answering numbers I did not know. I was not answering much of anything. I almost deleted it without listening. I played it standing in the parking lot of a grocery store, 2 weeks after Walter's burial, the day after James put my belongings in a trash bag. The voice was measured, precise. It said Walter had asked him to reach out. It left a name, Desmond Howard, and a number. It said there was no urgency on my end, only readiness. I played it twice. 3 days after they handed me that bag, I was still sleeping in my friend's guest room with my clothes folded on a chair, because I had not bought a suitcase yet, and I was not ready to admit that I needed one. I had not told her about the farmhouse. I had not told the attorney either, the one I called before the eviction. the one who told me I needed to see the will first. I had not told anyone. Some things you have to approach alone or not at all. Desmond Howard's voicemail was still sitting unanswered on my phone. I had listened to it twice and set it down both times. Whatever he needed to tell me, I was not ready to hear it from someone else's mouth before I had seen it for myself. Walter left me a key and an address. That came first. Before I started the car, I sent my friend a text. The full address from Walter's card. No explanation, just going to check something. Back by evening. Address if you need me. 40 years of being the person who thinks ahead does not stop because your life has come apart. The drive out of Birmingham took everything familiar with it gradually. The intersections I knew, the buildings I could name, the particular skyline that had been the backdrop of my adult life. Then the city thinned. Trees replaced it. The road narrowed without announcing it. And the address on Walter's card led me further than I expected, down a rural stretch with no landmarks I recognized. 40 minutes. Walter had driven this road every Sunday for 10 years, and I had never once thought to wonder where he was going. The property came into view without drama, modest, set back from the road, surrounded on three sides by trees that were too deliberately placed to be accidental. Walter had chosen not to clear them, and now I understood why. Privacy was the architecture. The house itself sat quiet inside it. Maintained. That was the word that landed. Not decorated, not staged. Maintained. There is a difference between a place someone lives in and a place someone tends. This had been tended. I sat in the car longer than I meant to. Then I got out. The path to the door was short. My footsteps on it felt too loud. I took the key from my purse, the same key I had carried since Mother's Day, without knowing what it opened, and I put it in the lock. It turned without resistance. Not the reluctant turn of a lock that has been left alone. The easy, practiced turn of something used regularly, maintained like everything else on this property. That small, mechanical fact landed somewhere in my chest before I could stop it. I pushed the door open. The room was clean, organized. That was the first thing my eyes registered, and it took my breath in a way I was not prepared for. Because clean meant tended, and tended meant intentional. And intentional meant Walter had been coming out here for a decade, with a purpose I knew nothing about. The second thing was the smell. Wood and cedar, and underneath it something fainter, the trace of a man I had shared a bed with for 40 years, still present, still his. The third thing was on the far wall, a framed photograph, a child, a girl, 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a school I did not recognize. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at something to the side, something outside the frame, something only she could see. She had Walter's eyes. My hand found the door frame. I stood there for a moment that had no real length. Then I made myself walk further into the room. That was when I saw the table. The table was long and wooden and completely clear except for 3 folders laid side by side, like someone had measured the space between them. My name was on the largest one. I stood in front of that table for a moment I could not have timed. The organization of it, the deliberateness, the precision, was so entirely Walter that it stopped my breath. This was not a room someone had left in a hurry. This was a room someone had finished. I pulled out the largest folder first. Inside was a deed, a property deed for the farmhouse I was standing in. I read the name on it once, and then I read it again because the first time did not take. My name. Elaine Voss, not Walter's, mine. Dated 5 years ago. I had owned this property for 5 years without knowing it existed. Beneath the deed was a single typed page clipped neatly behind it. No signature, no greeting, just one sentence. If James ever pressures you about transfers, signatures, or emergency authority, call Desmond first. I stared at that line longer than I stared at the deed. Not because I understood it fully yet, because of the date. 3 years ago. Long before the diagnosis. Long before the funeral. Long before a trash bag appeared in my doorway. Something cold moved quietly through me then. Not panic, not fear, exactly. The realization that Walter had not hidden this place only to protect something. He had hidden it because he expected something. I set the paper down and reached for the first smaller folder. I expected business documents, financial records, something connected to the estate James was already dismantling. What I found instead made me forget James entirely. The early pages were sparse. A birth record, a document I would later understand, established paternity, a photograph, a child, barely visible, taken from a distance that told me everything about where Walter was standing emotionally when he took it. At the edge of something, not yet inside it. Then the pages shifted. More photographs. Closer. A school event. The child in a group, Walter somewhere nearby. The camera catching what his presence meant even when he was not the subject. A birthday card in his handwriting. A receipt for a gift delivered to an address in Anniston. A girl growing up across the pages. Walter growing closer across the same pages. The last photograph in the folder was the girl from the wall. Older now. 20 maybe. Standing outside a building I did not recognize. Smiling the way people smile when they are not performing it. She had Walter's eyes, and she had learned, somewhere along the way, to carry them without apology. I went back to the beginning and read the entire folder again. Then I reached for the second one. The structure was similar, but not identical. Different years, different city, different mother. The same sparse, cold opening, a birth record, a distance photograph, the documented evidence of a man keeping himself at arm's length from something he had created and could not yet face. Then the same gradual turn. Closer photographs, a boy, this time, raised in Huntsville. Same Walter, older now in the pictures, carrying less distance in his posture than he had in the earlier folder. That mattered to me more than I wanted it to. Not because it excused anything, because it meant these were not parallel secret lives unfolding at the same time. They were separate failures, years apart, handled badly in different ways by the same man before he finally began trying to handle anything honestly. The last photograph was a young man standing outside a church. He had Walter's jaw. He was not smiling, but there was something in his expression I recognized. The particular steadiness of someone who has decided to be present, even when presence costs something. I stood at that table holding that photograph, and I understood that I was looking at a decade of Sundays. Every week, Walter drove 40 minutes outside the city and sat with what he had done and what he was trying to correct. And I had never once asked him where he was going, because I trusted him. I had trusted him completely. My legs stopped working. I sat down on the floor, not a choice, a result, and I stayed there in the quiet of that room, with Walter's careful organization above me and the smell of cedar around me and nothing in my chest that I had a name for. That was when I saw it. At the underside of the table, a sealed envelope taped flush against the wood, invisible from standing height. My name on the front in Walter's handwriting. I reached up and touched it. I did not take it down. Not yet. I did not open the envelope. I knew I was not ready, and I did not pretend otherwise. I left it where it was, taped to the underside of that table in Walter's careful hand. And I stood up from the floor, and I texted my friend 2 sentences. Staying here tonight. I'm fine. Then I learned the house. That is the only way I can describe what I did in those first hours. I moved through each room slowly, not searching, just absorbing. Where the light switches were, which cabinet held the extra blankets. Folded with the same precision Walter applied to everything he considered worth maintaining. The particular sound the floorboards made near the back window. The way the kitchen faucet needed a firm hand to stop completely. Small things. The grammar of a space. You only learn it if you intend to stay. I had owned this property for 5 years. It did not feel like mine yet, but it did not feel entirely foreign either, and that somehow was harder to sit with than strangeness would have been. I thought about 40 years, not the broad sweep of it, the milestones, the anniversaries, the version of our marriage I would have described to anyone who asked. I thought about the specific texture of him. The way Walter laughed at things he found genuinely funny versus things he found politely amusing. 2 completely different sounds, and I was the only person who knew the difference. The way he apologized without ever using the word sorry, through action, through presence, through the particular quality of his attention the day after a disagreement. The way he made decisions alone and presented them as finished products, as if the process of deciding was something too private to share. I held that man alongside the man in those folders. I did not try to make them the same person. They were the same person. That was the part I had to sit with. Not the contradiction, but the completeness. Walter was capable of keeping his distance from 2 children for years. Walter was also capable of driving 40 minutes every Sunday for a decade to close that distance slowly, carefully, at a cost no one else could see. Both things were true. I did not forgive him that night. I did not condemn him either. I simply let both things be true at the same time and discovered that my hands were steadier than I expected them to be. On the shelf beside the window, I found a journal. Not a confessional, nothing dramatic or self-indulgent. A practical document, dates of visits, notes about the children, brief observations written in the same deliberate print as the card he left beside my coffee cup. The early entries were sparse, businesslike, the writing of a man keeping himself at a careful remove from what he was doing. The later entries were longer, more personal, the writing of someone who had stopped pretending that showing up occasionally was the same as being present. One entry, written 3 years ago, stopped me entirely. Thomas asked me why I waited so long. I told him I didn't have a good answer. He said that was probably the most honest thing I'd ever said to him. We sat with that for a while. I think that's what trying looks like sometimes. I read it twice. Then I turned to the last entry. 3 days before Mother's Day. The handwriting was slower than the earlier pages. I noticed it without understanding it yet. But the sentences were precise, finished. The last line read, "She'll know what to do. She always did." I closed the journal. Outside the window, the trees Walter had chosen not to clear stood in the dark, doing exactly what he planted them to do. By morning, I had moved from processing to the edge of deciding. I called the number from the parking lot of the farmhouse the morning after I stayed. He answered on the second ring. His name was Desmond Howard. He confirmed it before I asked. Walter's estate attorney. Briefed to contact me after Walter's death and to wait until I was ready. I asked him how he knew I had been to the farmhouse. He said Walter told him I would go within a week of the eviction. Walter was right. He usually was. Desmond's office was downtown Birmingham. When I walked in, his assistant looked up and did not ask my name. She simply said Mr. Howard was expecting me and gestured toward a hallway. I had not told anyone I was coming. Desmond stood before I sat. His office was the kind of space that communicates competence without announcing it. Nothing excessive, nothing performative. He was precise in the way of someone who considered imprecision a form of disrespect. I noticed the difference between precise and cold immediately. They are not the same thing. He walked me through everything Walter had built. The farmhouse deed, transferred into my name 5 years ago, recorded in a county outside Birmingham, entirely separate from the probate estate James's attorney was currently reviewing. It had not been in Walter's name at the time of his death. James could challenge it if he chose to, Desmond explained. But the transfer predated Walter's illness timeline by years and had been executed cleanly enough that overturning it would be difficult without evidence of coercion. That distinction mattered to me. Not untouchable, defensible. There were 2 trusts, one for a young woman named Rael, one for a young man named Thomas. Irrevocable, fully funded. My name listed as administrative trustee. Not because I controlled the assets, Desmond was careful to explain, but because Walter needed someone precise and trusted to ensure proper distribution. The assets belonged to the children. My function was execution. Then Desmond told me about the private investigator. 3 years ago, Walter hired someone to document a pattern he had noticed in the joint business account he shared with James. What that investigator found was 18 months of systematic withdrawals. Small enough individually to appear administrative, mapped together unmistakably intentional. Walter brought the file to Desmond. Walter then spent the following year quietly removing James from every business structure that file touched. Not perfectly, quietly. A signature authority reduced here, an account access changed there. Oversight added in places James would not immediately notice. One transfer Walter wanted completed before his final hospitalization had never actually gone through. Because the bank required an additional authorization, he became too sick to provide. Desmond admitted some of the restructuring had been preventative rather than punitive. Walter trying to limit future damage more than destroy his son. James did not know Walter knew. The truth is, Desmond said carefully, Walter wasn't building an unbeatable structure. He was building enough separation that one person's bad decisions couldn't collapse everything else with them. That landed harder than perfection would have. The demand letter James filed, the one implying I had manipulated Walter's decisions, had made that documentation newly relevant. Because if James's argument was that Walter's judgment was compromised, Walter's documented response to James's own financial misconduct was evidence of a man operating with full clarity. Strong evidence, Desmond corrected himself, not magic. I sat with that for a moment. Before I stood to leave, I asked him one question. Whether Walter had known he was going to die before the doctors confirmed it. Desmond was quiet for a breath. Then he said Walter told him he had always known James would be a problem. He simply had not known when. When the diagnosis came, Walter told Desmond he was grateful for the timeline. It gave him enough time to finish what he had started. Then, after another pause, Desmond added something else. He also told me he wasn't certain any of this would hold exactly the way he intended, only that leaving it unfinished would guarantee it didn't. That sounded more like Walter than perfection ever could. I thanked Desmond. I walked back through the hallway. His assistant did not look up this time. The visit was already complete in the way of things that had been prepared for and were now simply done. I pushed through the front door into the afternoon. James's car was parked across the street. He was watching the building. He did not see me register it. I gave his car 1 second of my attention, and then I walked to my own, started the engine, and drove. He had no idea what was inside that office. It arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the funeral, 1 week after James retained his attorney. because James understood that timing communicated something and he had been careful to let a respectable interval pass before he moved formally. It was at my friend's address. That did not surprise me. A man who had been watching Desmond Howard's office from across the street would have had no difficulty finding where I was sleeping. I read it at the kitchen table while my friend was at work. The letter was aggressive in the way of something written by an attorney who had been given too much confidence by his client. It demanded a full accounting of estate assets. It contested Walter's mental competency in the final months of his life, and it argued, in language that was precise enough to be intentional, that I had exercised undue influence over Walter's decisions during a period of cognitive decline. I read that last section twice. To make the undue influence argument, James's attorney had to account for the farmhouse deed transfer, the document that moved the property into my name 5 years ago. An attorney reviewing Walter's estate would have found it eventually. What they could not explain was why a man would transfer a property to his wife years before his death unless something or someone had influenced him to do it. Their explanation was me. I had manipulated Walter. I had positioned myself. I had engineered a transfer that benefited me at the expense of his estate and his son. I sat with that accusation for a long moment. There was no laughter in me. What there was instead was something closer to clarity. The specific understanding of a woman who has just been told she built the very thing she was standing inside of without knowing it existed. Walter had constructed something precise and patient and deliberately invisible, and James's attorney had looked at it and seen my fingerprints because they could not imagine any other explanation. Walter had known they wouldn't. I called Desmond. He listened to me read the relevant sections without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for exactly the length of time it takes a precise man to decide on precise words. They don't know what they don't know yet. He told me to let him respond. He told me to trust the process Walter had built, but not to confuse preparation with certainty. He said the private investigator's documentation, the 18 months of systematic withdrawals from the joint business account, was now newly relevant because James's attorney had created the legal opening to examine Walter's decision-making timeline in detail. Walter's estate decisions were not the product of a compromised mind. They were the documented response of a man operating with complete clarity to years of financial misconduct by his own son. Desmond would make that argument with everything Walter had left him to make it with. Then, for the first time since I met him, he admitted something imperfect. "The evidence is strong," he said carefully. "But strong and automatic are not the same thing. Courts don't reward preparation. They test it." That landed harder than reassurance would have. I thanked him and sat back in the chair. For the first time since Walter died, I felt the full weight of my position, not pressing down on me, but holding me up. Something engineered to bear load. Walter had known what James would probably do, and he had built accordingly. And he had placed me at the center of it because he trusted that I would stand where he put me. I was standing. An hour later, Desmond called back. He had reviewed the full investigator's file against the demand letter's specific claims. There was one additional piece of documentation the letter had made newly relevant, something that concerned the family home directly. He would not explain it over the phone. He said I needed to come back in. Desmond arranged the meeting. A quiet restaurant in Anniston, halfway between Birmingham and where Raelle Burden had lived her entire life, in a city Walter had chosen specifically because it sat outside his Birmingham world. That geography was intentional. Everything Walter did was intentional. I was beginning to understand that about him in ways I had not needed to before. I arrived first. She was already at the table. I saw her before she saw me, and I stopped walking for just a moment. Not long enough for anyone to notice, but long enough for something to land. The resemblance to Walter was not the kind that announces itself. It was specific. something around the eyes, the way she held her shoulders, that particular set, as if she had decided early that the world would not see her fold. I knew before I reached the table. She stood when I approached. We did not embrace. We sat. The conversation opened carefully on both sides. Rael was composed in the way of someone who had been composing herself around this situation for a very long time. Not performing calm, but genuinely inhabiting it. The way you inhabit something you have had years to build. She did not perform pain. She did not perform gratitude. She looked at me directly and asked her question without preamble. Did he ever mention me? By name. I told her the truth. No. I had not known she existed until I found the farmhouse. The answer landed. She did not look away. She processed it in the specific silence of someone absorbing something they already suspected, but needed confirmed. Then she said, "He talked about you. He said you were the only person he fully trusted." I did not know what to do with that. She watched me not knowing. Something passed between us in that moment. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular recognition of two women who had been handed the same incomplete man from completely opposite directions, and were now sitting across a table trying to decide what that made them to each other. She told me Walter had come to see her 2 weeks before Mother's Day. He told her something was coming. He told her a woman named Elaine would eventually be in contact, and that when she was, Rael should listen before she judged. He told her he had spent years doing it wrong and a smaller number of years trying to correct it, and that the correction was the most honest thing he had ever done. She reached into her bag and placed a photograph on the table between us. Walter. 15 years ago, standing outside the farmhouse, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. Younger, lighter in the face than I remembered him being in those years. He took me there once, she said. Just once. A pause. He said it was where he went to think, that it was the only place he ever figured anything out. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then I asked about Thomas. Her expression shifted, not negatively, but carefully. The way you shift when you are choosing words for something that does not have easy ones. He's not going to make it easy, she said, but he showed up. That matters to him even when he won't say so. I thanked her. We stood. Still no embrace. But something had changed in the air between us that had not been there when I walked in. I was 40 minutes outside Anniston when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. The voice was older, deliberate, unhurried. This is Dina Vick. I believe you've met my son. I think it's time we spoke. The diner was Dina's choice. That told me something before she said a word. A woman who chooses her own ground for a difficult conversation is a woman who has learned exactly how much energy she has and has decided not to spend any of it on comfort she did not arrange herself. She was already seated when I arrived. Older than I expected, not in appearance exactly, but in the specific quality of her stillness. The stillness of someone who had processed something large a long time ago and was no longer in any hurry about anything. She did not stand. She nodded once and waited for me to sit. I'm not here about Walter, she said, before I had settled, before I had spoken. I made my peace with Walter years ago. What I'm here about is my son. She was not hostile. She was not soft. She was precise in the way of someone who had given herself a specific task and intended to complete it without detour. She told me that 3 years ago, when Walter first reached out to Thomas, Thomas refused him entirely, did not meet him, did not call him back. Instead, he sat down and wrote Walter a letter, 2 pages, handwritten, explaining in specific terms what the years of absence had cost him and what he did not need from a man who had finally decided he had time now that Thomas was grown. Walter received the letter. He read it. He kept it. But he did not file it at the farmhouse with everything else. He gave it to Dina instead with one instruction, that she hold it until she decided the right person needed to read it. Then, before she handed it to me, she added something else. Walter thought he could organize damage into something manageable if he labeled it carefully enough, she said quietly. The folders, the trusts, the notes, all of it. A pause. Some things don't organize that neatly. That landed somewhere deeper than criticism would have. She reached into her bag and placed the letter on the table between us. He agreed to the trust, she said. He didn't agree to you. There's a difference. You need to know who you're walking in to meet. I took the letter. We sat for a few minutes more. Not in conversation exactly. In the particular quiet of two women who have both been shaped by the same man's decisions, without ever having been in the same room before. She drank her coffee. I held the letter without opening it. Then she surprised me. James contacted Thomas once, she said, almost absently. Last year. I looked up. He didn't know who he was talking to. Walter had introduced Thomas as someone's son from Huntsville during a business dinner. She stirred her coffee once, though she had already stopped drinking it. James spent 20 minutes explaining how impossible it was to manage aging parents once they stopped making rational decisions. I said nothing. He said people get sentimental near the end, vulnerable. Easier to steer if you've positioned yourself correctly. The diner noise continued around us. Plates, silverware, somebody laughing near the counter. Dina looked at me directly. Thomas remembered every word after Walter contacted him. Something cold moved quietly through me then. Not shock, recognition. When she stood to leave, she paused. Walter told me something once, she said. He said his greatest talent was finding the right person and then getting out of their way. She picked up her bag. He was talking about you. She said it the way you report the weather. No warmth in it, no coldness. Just a fact she had been holding that now belonged to me. Then she walked out. I sat at that table alone for a while. The diner moved around me, other conversations, other lives, the ordinary noise of a Tuesday afternoon in Birmingham, and I sat in the middle of it holding 2 pages of a young man's handwriting that his father had loved enough not to archive. That evening, in the guest room at my friend's house, I read Thomas's letter. I will not share what it said. It was not mine to share. It was his. And the fact that I was allowed to read it at all was a grace I did not take lightly. What I can tell you is that his anger was not the unfocused kind. It was specific, dated, built from the particular architecture of a child who had learned to measure a father's love in absences. It was entirely fair. I closed the letter and sat with it in my lap for a long time. I knew exactly who I was walking in to meet. I started the car. He was already standing when I walked in. Not the way you stand to greet someone. The way you stand when you have decided that a room is yours before anyone else arrives in it. He was at the far side of the table, arms at his sides, watching the door. 23 years old and carrying something in his posture that I recognized. The specific weight of a person who has been disappointed enough times that they have stopped leaving room for it to surprise them. He did not offer his hand. I sat down. After a moment, he sat across from me. I don't know why he thought you were trustworthy, he said. Not loudly, not with performance. The way you say something you have been thinking long enough that it has lost its edges. Being trusted by a man who spent years not showing up doesn't strike me as much of a credential. I looked at him directly. You're right, I said. It isn't. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. He had been prepared for defense, for me to explain Walter, justify the years, soften the edges of what his father had been. He was not prepared for agreement. I watched him recalibrate without moving. I had read his letter the night before. I knew what he carried. I was not going to pretend otherwise. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive him," I said. "I'm not here to ask you to trust me. I'm here because Walter asked me to be, and because I believe you deserve to know the truth about what concerns you." I told him what the trust contained, what it was structured to do over time, what my role as administrative trustee actually meant in practice. I was the mechanism, not the authority. The assets were his. The structure was his father's. My function was to ensure it reached him correctly and completely, nothing added and nothing removed. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, I gathered my bag and stood. He spoke before I reached the door. "Did you know about us?" Not a question exactly, a test. "Before the farmhouse." I turned. "No." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a single small movement that closed something without naming it. I walked to my car. The afternoon was quiet around me. I sat for a moment before starting the engine, thinking about what Dina had said in the diner, that Walter's greatest talent was finding the right person and getting out of their way. I thought about that talent from the other side of it. Finding the right person and stepping back still required someone to step forward. Walter had laid something down and trusted that the person he chose would pick it up. The folders, the deed, the trusts, the envelope still taped under that table. All of it laid down carefully, deliberately, and left for hands that were not his. My hands. I did not know yet whether what I was carrying was a gift or a weight. I suspected it was both simultaneously and that the distinction would matter less over time than I currently thought it did. What I knew was this. I had never once in my life refused to do something because it was hard. I started the car and pulled onto the road. I was back in Desmond's office 2 days after meeting Thomas. He did not open with pleasantries. He pulled a document from the file on his desk and placed it in front of me and let me read the relevant section before he explained it. The 18 months of withdrawals James made from the joint business account had not drawn only from business funds. Walter's portion of that account included marital assets, money that belonged to both of us, accumulated across decades of a shared life. What James had taken was not purely business capital. A calculable portion of it was marital property. Under Alabama's Elder Financial Exploitation Statute, assets dissipated through documented financial misconduct could potentially be traced through the estate. The family home, transferred to James in Walter's will, sat within the value range of what had been taken. Desmond was careful with the next part. "This does not mean a court simply hands you the house," he said. "What it means is that the documented losses create leverage for reallocation discussions, structured recovery claims, and potentially a settlement framework tied to estate assets." That distinction mattered. He could argue, and intended to, that the home transfer should be subject to court scrutiny and possible negotiated offset against the documented losses. Not as punishment, as correction. A documented, calculable wrong being set against a documented, calculable asset. I read the page twice, then I looked up. Did Walter know this would happen? Desmond was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was being precise rather than hesitant. "He knew what he documented," he said. "He trusted the statute to do the rest." I sat with that. Walter had not needed to engineer James's downfall directly. He had only needed to record what James was already doing and trust that the law was built to respond to exactly that kind of behavior. The rest followed on its own. Desmond filed the counter documentation that afternoon. The elder financial exploitation claim now carried two distinct pillars: the documented verbal pressure campaign Walter had recorded, and the financial misconduct the investigator had mapped across 18 months. Together, they were not a suggestion. They were a case. James's attorney received the filing and went silent. Desmond told me 72 hours of silence from opposing counsel meant one thing. They were recalculating. Everything they believed they knew about the shape of this estate had just changed underneath them. 3 days after the filing, James appeared outside my friend's house. He did not knock. He parked across the street and sat in his car for 40 minutes. I watched him from the upstairs window, not with fear, with attention. There is a difference. Fear makes you small. Attention makes you accurate. When he drove away, I called Desmond. I gave him the date, the time, the duration, the make of the car. He told me to write it down exactly as I had just said it, and to send it to him in a message so there was a time-stamped record. He added it to the file without comment. It was the kind of behavior, he said, that belonged in a record. I agreed. That evening, I sat in the guest room and thought about James parked outside in the dark, watching a house where he believed I had nothing and knew nothing and was simply waiting to be managed. I thought about what he did not know was inside Desmond's office. I thought about Claudette Sims at the funeral, her expression, her brief exchange with James, the way she left early without explanation. As if he had read my thought, Desmond called. He had reached Claudette. She had agreed to come in voluntarily. No request needed, no formal process. He told me what she said when he called her. She had been waiting for someone to ask. Claudette Sims sat across from us, and she was the steadiest person in the room. She was 70 years old, and she had the particular composure of someone who had decided exactly what she was going to say before she arrived, and had no intention of saying anything beyond it. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at me once, directly, briefly, and then she looked at Desmond, and she began. 6 weeks before Walter died, she had come to the house, a regular visit, the kind that happens between people who have known each other long enough that showing up requires no specific occasion. She and Walter had worked together for years before her retirement. They had remained what she called quietly friendly, which I understood to mean genuinely fond of each other in a way neither of them would have made a production of. She was in the kitchen when James's voice rose in the hallway. That hallway, she said, did not carry sound the way James apparently believed it did. She did not move toward it. She stayed where she was, and she listened, because the alternative was to make noise and announce herself. And she understood, instinctively, that what was happening in that hallway was not meant to have a witness. James told Walter that once the estate transferred, I would have nothing that couldn't be undone. He told Walter that my name on anything was a problem he intended to address. He told Walter that his patience with how Walter had managed the business, with his own exclusion from it, had reached its end, and that Walter's reluctance to involve him properly was something he planned to correct once the estate was settled. Claudette delivered each of these without inflection, the way you read coordinates, precise and without editorial. Then she told us what Walter said. 4 words: quiet, controlled, final. It's already been corrected. She paused. She told us she had not understood those words when she heard them. Standing in Walter's kitchen, she thought it was simply Walter refusing to be moved. The particular stillness he deployed when he had already made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. In Desmond's office, with the estate timeline in front of her, she understood that Walter had filed the last of his restructuring documents that same week. He was not responding to James's threat. He was telling James, without James understanding it, that the threat had already been rendered irrelevant. She had nothing further to add. She stood, shook Desmond's hand, nodded at me, and left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. That evening, James called my phone directly. For the first time, I did not answer. I let it go to voicemail, and I listened to the message an hour later, sitting in the guest room with the light off. He did not threaten me. That was the thing that stayed with me. He sounded careful, measured in the way of someone who has run a calculation and does not like the result. He said we should talk. He said there were things that could be resolved between us without involving courts. He sounded, for the first time, like a man who was beginning to understand the shape of what he was standing inside. I set the phone down without calling back. 20 minutes later, Raelle called. James's attorney had contacted her. They had found her somehow, and they knew about the trust, and she said it was clear they were trying to determine whether her existence could be shaped into a counterclaim against me. "They thought I'd be angry at you," she said. A pause. "I told them they had the wrong read." He found the address the way anyone with determination and a county records database would find it. The deed was public record. I had known that. I had not known when he would use it. He was standing in the driveway when I pulled in. No attorney beside him. No legal language prepared. Just James, in the morning light, with his hands at his sides and something in his face that I had not seen there before. Not anger, exactly, but what anger looks like when it has run out of places to be controlled. I did not get out of the car immediately. I called Desmond. I told him where I was and who was standing 10 feet from my front bumper. I told him I was going in. He said nothing except, "Leave the line open." Then, after a brief pause, he added quietly that Alabama was a one-party consent state, and that as long as I remained part of the conversation, the recording was lawful. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and I got out of the car. James did not wait for me to reach him. He said Walter was weak, that a man who spent his life building something real had spent his final years being managed by a woman who had positioned herself carefully and benefited from a trust she had manufactured. He said my name on the farmhouse deed was the proof of it, that no man transfers property years before his death unless someone is guiding the decision behind the scenes. He said what he thought about Raelle and Thomas. That is the part I will not repeat in detail because some things, once given language, belong only to the person who said them and to whatever account they will one day have to make of themselves. What I will tell you is that his reaction to those two young people, to their existence, to their place in what Walter had built, was not the grief of a son learning his father was imperfect. It was the rage of a man whose calculation had been disrupted. He did not grieve them. He resented the space they occupied in an inheritance he had already divided in his own mind. He spoke for a long time. I let him finish. When the driveway was quiet again, I looked at my son, this man I had held as an infant, had sat beside through childhood fevers, had watched become someone I increasingly did not recognize. And I said the only thing that was entirely true. Your father knew exactly who you were. He loved you anyway. He just couldn't trust you. James looked at me for a moment that had no warmth in it anywhere. Then he got in his car and drove away. I went inside. The farmhouse was quiet around me in the way it was always quiet, not empty, maintained. I sat down at the long wooden table and I reached for the envelope I had moved from beneath it the night I stayed, placed on the shelf beside the journal, waiting at a distance I could manage. I had been moving toward it across weeks without admitting that was what I was doing. I held it in both hands. Almost. My phone buzzed, Desmond's name on the screen. I answered. He had heard everything through the open line, every word James said in that driveway, about Walter, about me, about Raelle and Thomas. was recorded. Clean audio, time-stamped. He said it quietly, with the precision I had come to understand was his version of emphasis. That's the final exhibit. The case is complete. Then, more carefully, not guaranteed, but complete. There's a difference. I understood what he meant. Evidence was not the same thing as certainty. Walter had built the structure. Desmond had strengthened it where he could. The court would still decide what survived contact, with another side determined not to lose. 3 days later, he called again. The hearing date had been set. I had imagined the hearing differently. I thought I would feel something sharp when it began. Anticipation, or dread, or the particular electricity of a moment you have been moving toward for weeks. What I felt instead, sitting in that room, was very quiet. The way you feel when something large is finally happening after a long time, of it only being imminent. James was 2 rows ahead of me. I could see the line of his shoulders. They were set the way they had been in every room I had watched him occupy across the past months, with the confidence of a man who believes he has already won and is simply waiting for the formality of confirmation. That line changed across the morning. I watched it happen. Desmond did not perform. He presented. There is a difference, and the courtroom felt it. He laid the pieces down in sequence: Claudette's testimony, her account of the hallway conversation, and the 4 words Walter said. The private investigator's records, 18 months of withdrawals mapped against each other until the pattern was undeniable. The recording from the farmhouse driveway, James's own voice, his own words about Rael and Thomas, time-stamped and clean. Walter's medical records confirming cognitive precision until the final week of his life. The dates on every estate document Walter signed, every transfer, every restructuring, all of it predating by more than a year, the period of decline James's attorney had characterized as the window of undue influence. James's attorney made his argument with precision. I will give him that. The undue influence claim had a surface logic: a wife, a property transfer, a dying man. He constructed it carefully, and for a moment it occupied the room with the weight of something credible. Then Desmond introduced the timeline. Every document James's attorney pointed to as evidence of my influence had been signed before the period his own argument required. The dates did not bend. The argument weakened under the weight of its own chronology, not dramatically, not with a single decisive moment, but with the steady, inevitable logic of a structure meeting the evidence it was built to withstand. The judge recessed before issuing findings. That pause mattered more than I expected. The room lost its performance then. Attorneys leaned together quietly. Papers shifted. James spoke sharply to his lawyer once and stopped when the lawyer did not respond the way he wanted. Time passed in the heavy, procedural way real things pass. When everyone returned, the atmosphere had changed. Before the ruling was finalized, James's attorney requested a settlement conference. That was the moment I understood they saw the direction this was heading. The negotiations stretched across the afternoon and into the following morning. Numbers, asset, schedules, structured recovery proposals, probate exposure calculations. Desmond explained very little while it was happening, except that opposing counsel was trying to limit how much of the estate structure could be reopened once the exploitation findings entered the record. The final agreement was not a dramatic seizure. It was recalculation shaped under pressure. The court found sufficient evidence of documented financial exploitation and breach of fiduciary responsibility connected to the joint business accounts. The value traced through those withdrawals became the framework for the settlement that followed. The family home, the property James had used to remove me from my own life 4 days after I buried my husband, was folded into that resolution through negotiated reallocation against the documented losses rather than outright confiscation. The commercial property holdings were restructured into a managed trust with supervised annual distributions, significantly less than James had planned for. I watched him go pale. Not gradually, suddenly, the way color leaves a face when the body understands something before the mind catches up. Patrice was sitting directly behind him. She did not reach forward. She did not touch his arm. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. I did not feel triumph. I felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has finally been told she can set it down. I thought about Walter, about what it cost him to build all of this alone, in a farmhouse 40 minutes outside the city, across 10 years of Sundays, without telling me any of it. I thought it was the wrong choice. I thought it was probably the only one he knew how to make. Both things were true. They had always both been true. Driving home, I passed the street where the family home sat. I did not slow down. For the first time since the morning I found that key at the bottom of my purse, the farmhouse felt like somewhere I was going, rather than somewhere I was escaping to. I opened it on a Thursday evening. Alone at the long wooden table, the light coming through the window at the angle it came through in the late afternoon. The specific gold of early evening that I had learned across the weeks I had been sleeping here, the light that meant the trees outside were doing exactly what Walter had planted them to do. I broke the seal. I unfolded the pages. I began to read. He opened with my name. Just my name. The way you say something when you want to be sure the person you are speaking to understands that you see them completely. He told me about the diagnosis, not to explain himself. He was past explanation and he knew it. He said he did not know how to be dying and simultaneously be asking me for things. That those two positions could not occupy the same conversation. I did not agree with his reasoning. I understood it. I told myself clearly, reading it, that those were not the same thing, and that I had always known the difference. He told me about Sylvia, about Rael, the years he kept his distance, not because he did not know better, but because knowing better and doing better are separated by something he did not cross for a long time. He wrote about what finally broke him open, not a single event, an accumulation, the specific loneliness of a man who has been performing correctness for so long that he has forgotten what it costs to keep performing it. I cried at that point. Not for myself. For a 12-year-old girl in Anniston who watched a man begin, slowly and imperfectly, to try. He told me about Dina, about Thomas. The same reckoning, different faces, and the same Walter arriving late to something he should have shown up for from the beginning. He told me what Thomas's letter gave him. The truth, unmoderated, about what the absence had cost. He wrote that Thomas was the only person who had ever told him exactly what he had done, without softening it first. He said he kept the letter because he needed to be told. Then he wrote one line that stopped me completely. I had a picture in my mind of how that meeting between you would go. I know it was harder than what I pictured. I know that because you are reading this, which means you found your way through it. That is the thing I could not have scripted. I sat with that for a moment. He was right that he could not have scripted it. I was also right that I found my way through without his script. I held both of those things at the same time, which I had learned across the past months was the only honest way to hold anything that involved Walter. He told me why he chose me. Not proximity, not obligation. Because across 40 years he had watched me hold difficult things, loss, disappointment, the specific weight of loving people who did not always love well. And he had never once seen me drop any of it. You were always the most capable person in any room I ever shared with you. I was too proud to say so when it would have counted. I am saying it now because late is better than never. And never was the only other option. He closed with my name again. And then, you always knew how to hold things carefully. I was talking about you. I was always talking about you. I folded the letter. I held it against my chest and I sat at that table for a long time while the light changed around me. Thomas called 3 days later to check on me. He did not explain why. I did not tell him what his mother said in that diner parking lot. Some things you receive and keep. Desmond closed the last administrative document the following week. Before I left his office, he told me that in 30 years of practice, he had never seen a plan executed with more precision by someone who had no idea they were part of it until it was already in motion. I thanked him and meant it completely. James received his first structured distribution a month later. I did not think about what he did with it. I had said what I needed to say in that driveway. What came after was his. Patrice was not part of what came after. I registered that the way you register a change in weather, noted, unsurprising, already passed. I moved properly into the farmhouse, not as an ending, as a choice. I rearranged the main room slightly. The long table stayed. The folders were gone, their purposes served. The table was just a table now. On a Sunday morning, I stood at the door. The trees Walter kept for privacy stood in the early light, doing exactly what he planted them to do. I thought about a man I had known for 40 years and had not fully known. I thought about what it means to love someone you cannot completely understand. I decided, more finely than I had decided anything, that it means something anyway. I looked down at my hand. The key was in my palm. I closed my fingers around it. He wasn't talking about the key.